Hello, and welcome to Tea with Jess. I'm author Jess Montgomery, and I'm delighted that you're joining me for a bit of a tea break. As Nana says in my kinship mystery series, life is hard, have tea. And today my mug is from Sisters in Crime, a wonderful organization for men and women and all kinds of people who want to write mysteries and learn more about the industry. And it says murder, 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 and then coffee, 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 which I think is okay, even though we're doing Tea with Jess. So today I'm welcoming Karen Odden to Tea with Jess. Karen received her PhD in literature from New York University and subsequently taught at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her first novel, A Lady in the Smoke, was a USA Today bestseller, and A Dangerous Duet and Trace of Deceit have won awards for historical mystery and historical fiction. Her fourth mystery, Down a Dark River, just came out on November 9th, and 2021, and I'm really excited to welcome Karen to Tea with Jess. And welcome, Karen.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Good. It's nice to be here. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. And congratulations on your fourth novel coming out. Very exciting.
I know. I'm thrilled.
Oh, and I understand you have not only one, but two mugs to share. If you could describe them.
I do. So I have one to match you, which is my Sisters in Crime coffee, 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 murder, murder, murder.
Uh-huh.
And I have another one that my nephew Justin gave me for Christmas last year. It says, please do not annoy the writer. She may put you in a book and kill you. I have been known to put people in my books.
Yes, yes. That is the great thing about being, one of the great things about being a writer is you can be annoyed by people. And just, in real life, we have to be polite and not murder people. But in fiction, aha. So tell us, first, I want to hear about, tell us without spoilers, an overview of Down a Dark River.
So my first three books, Lady in the Smoke, Dangerous Duet, and A Trace of Deceit, all featured different young women protagonists in 1870s London. And each one of them is sort of accidentally pulled into an investigation. She becomes an amateur sleuth because someone she loves is either injured or murdered. And I loved writing those books, but I guess it was about maybe 7 years ago, I came upon a story that inspired me to want to write a different kind of book. And in this one, Inspector Michael Corvin, formerly of CD Whitechapel, formerly a thief and bare knuckles boxer, becomes a Scotland Yard inspector. And he investigates a series of murders, young women, mostly upper class, who are beautifully dressed, laid out in small boats and sent floating down the Thames, dead.
Great premise. I love it.
That's the premise. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So your novels are all set in the Victorian era, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm curious what drew you to this. I know you've been a scholar. You're a scholar in this era. So that makes me understand why, of course, you would draw upon that for your mysteries. But what drew you to this era for your academic studies, as well as for a background for your mysteries?
So back in the late 90s, I was at NYU and I was kind of casting around for an idea for my dissertation. And one of the things I realized was I was very interested in the history of trauma, or what some people call PTSD. A lot of people sort of position it as beginning in World War I, sort of as that's where the doctors were first talking about it. And this was when the soldiers were coming back from the trenches with all of those terrible, paralysis, loss of hearing, twitches,
shell
nightmares.
Right.
Exactly. And they called it shell shock. And then, but if you look back 30 years, you see Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer were finding all of those same sorts of bizarre symptoms in women who had been abused, and they called it hysteria.
Hmm.
If you go back even further, in 1860s, there was a group of medical men called railway surgeons, and they were finding these kinds of injuries with people who had been in railway accidents. Charles Dickens was in one, for example. In 1865, he was in the Standalones crash, and his entire carriage tipped on its side. And he was traveling with his mistress, the young, beautiful actress Ellen Ternan. His wife was home with their 10 children. So he crawls out of the carriage, drags Ellen, drags out her mother, and then he's walking around helping people. He's ministering to people with some brandy that he happened to have with them. And then the railway sent an express train from London. He hopped on, went home, and then the next day, he woke up and he had shakes that were so bad he couldn't sign his name. He developed a weird buzzing in his ear. He was so afraid of the nightmares he was having that he would stay at his desk and fall asleep at his desk rather than go to bed.
Wow.
And he died 5 years to the day after the collision.
Huh.
So his son wrote in his memoirs about his father, my dad never recovered. And my father never recovered from that railway crash. Now, he was fine. He was walking around helping people. So when I read this, I thought, okay, this sounds to me like PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't have that diagnosis back then, of course. They called it railway spine. And they theorized that when people were shaken up by the railway and thrown around, that it caused little cuts in their spine, which is why the symptoms manifested all over the body. Now, this is a complete fiction. This is not what happens, but this is what they said happened because they didn't know how to explain it. And also because under existing medical jurisprudence in the 1860s and 70s, you couldn't obtain compensation for just shock or terror or suffering. It needed to be linked to an organ, like literally organic, in order for you to get money from the railway company. So this is how people kind of got around that problem. Anyway, so once I realized that, I thought, well, I want to look at these railway disasters. And I started looking at cartoons, parliamentary papers, medical papers, legal papers, newspapers, novels, short stories. They were everywhere. Everyone was writing about them because everyone was frightened. And so that's what I wrote my dissertation about. And so my first book, when I sat down to write it some 16 years ago to start it, I decided, well, I'm going to take a woman and her mother and put them in a railway car and run it off the rails in 1874 London. And that's where it began. And then as I continued to do research in the 1870s, I realized what an amazing decade it is. Like it's truly, I think, the most interesting of Victoria's reign. And she was on the throne for a long time. She was on from 1837 to 1901. So it's a long period. But in those 1870s, as a result of a lot of social agitation, there was a reform bill in 1867 that extended the vote to yet another million men, and rising literacy rates, more newspapers. People were talking about stuff, and they were talking about things like, we need to get our kids educated. So, for example, a law was passed to make education mandatory for boys and girls up until age 12. That was brand new in the 70s. So and there were tons of them like that. There were a bunch of other ones too that were that affected things like the Marriage Act of 1870, which for the first time ever gave women the right to work, earn a wage, and keep it without handing it over to their husband for the first time ever. Wow. So there were all these laws that were changing the world, and I wanted to stay in that world as everything was changing.
Because it's fascinating. You mentioned, of course, it wasn't called PTSD, in the Great War or in the era you're writing about, but PTSD has always been around. As long as there have been humans, right, there's been PTSD by some name. And actually, that's one of the themes of my next kinship book, The Echoes. And one of the reasons I love writing in a historical setting, or one of the big things I've gotten out of that is just this reminder that humanity hasn't changed all that much what we call things, how we deal with it, our perspective, our point of view, how open-minded we are or not has changes over time. But humans are humans, wherever they're from, whenever they lived. So that's kind of what's appealing to me, both as a writer and as a reader of historical fiction, is somehow seeing problems that we're dealing with in current times, but also happening in past times, helps me understand humanity and maybe have a little more empathy than I might otherwise. So, what appeals to you, both as a writer and a reader, about historical setting in general in fiction?
That's a good question. Why do I go for history? I think that you are right that there's a way that it enables us to talk about things like empathy or injustice or revenge or trauma in a way that is a little bit removed, and so therefore maybe a little easier for people to grasp.
Yeah.
Sometimes when things are too current, they feel a little raw, and if you displace it to another time period, people can kind of I don't know, maybe take it in a different way, I think.
I think you're right. It can get very, if you're talking about triggers of PTSD now, it could get very heated if you have it in a very contemporary situation. And so then you're no longer talking about PTSD, for example, just to pick
Right.
one subject.
Mhm.
You're talking about the situation right now. But if you put it in the past, I like that word that you used, it's removed. So we can look at it with more objectivity and then maybe circle back around to going, oh,
Right.
wait a minute.
Yes, exactly. And it
So,
is interesting that a lot of times the stories that cause me to begin a book, sometimes they're historical, but sometimes they're present day. And then I just kind of take them, and that's what I did with like in Down a Duck River. It was a present day story, but I drove it right back to 1870s London.
interesting. So you mentioned that your first three novels have, they're standalones. They're if I'm remembering this right, they're connected, the
Yes. Right.
characters,
Mhm.
but they're not, it's not a traditional series of the same protagonist each book.
Right.
Whereas Down a Dark River debuts your Inspector Corbin. So what drew you to creating a series around one character after doing the three essentially standalones? And are there challenges and differences between the two approaches?
Uh, yes, there are. I think that part of the reason that I wanted to do the three standalones now, and they are connected. They're connected by time period, and there's
Mm-hmm.
also a few secondary characters, like Tom Flynn, my newspaperman, who
Mm-hmm.
is actually based on my high school English teacher, but he's a good guy. I don't kill him off. He appears in all of my books. But I think part of it was, as a new author, I thought, what if I start a series and maybe get 2 books in, 3 books in, and then I get bored? What if I can't think of anything new for this character to discover or uncover? And I think just with a little bit of writing experience and just knowing more about how to develop character and provide backstory and that kind of thing, I felt like I was ready to tackle a series with a character who actually can kind of anchor the series and stay with and stick with him for a while. Um, Michael Corvin, uh, he is orphaned when he is 12 in Whitechapel, and he's Irish, which is a problem when you're in 1870s London. But there was a sort of an enclave of Irish who had come over. Many of them had come over after, as a result of the potato famines. And this is something I looked up actually recently because I was curious. Do you know that 1 million Irish died in 5 years during the potato famines?
I did not know that. Oh
Isn't
my
that an
goodness.
astonishing number?
That is an astonishing number.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, I mean, obviously, I mean, it helps you understand why so many of them were coming over to Liverpool and then by way of Liverpool, usually down to London. Anyway, so Michael Corvin grows up and he starts thieving, which is, you know, kind of what a lot of young boys did when they were in dire straits. And then he's befriended by an Irish family and he moves in with them. And then he starts sort of bare knuckles boxing and working on the docks and, you know, and doing all this kind of thing. And forgive me, now I'm forgetting what your question was. I got sidetracked by thinking about Michael. Oh, about why I wanted to start. But so he felt to me like when I get him, he's 30 years old at the beginning of Down a Duck River. He has a big, hefty backstory, which I wrote up over the course of, say, 6 or 8 months and had all kinds of pieces that I haven't excavated yet.
Mm.
So, for example, his mother vanished when he was 12. He knew his father died young, when he was young, but he doesn't know what happened to his mother. I haven't even begun to touch that. And I don't actually touch it until sort of the very end of the second book that I'm beginning to work on now. So there's a piece. The other piece is that, for example, he moves in with the family, the Doyles, and there's he at the time is like around 14, and there are 2 twins, Colin and Elsie, who are 6. By the time he leaves Whitechapel, they're older, but Colin worships Michael Corvin. Like he's like, you know, he just thinks Corvin's, you know, the bomb, and so when Michael Corvin takes off and leaves, Colin is devastated, which is a piece that I gesture to a little bit in Down a Duck River, but fully excavate in the next one. But I tried to kind of, as I was developing him, I tried to stick a lot of, I don't know, for want of a word, baggage in the backstory, you know, between, you know,
humans have always had baggage, even if we didn't call it that.
Baggage. That's the interesting part. But that's what enables him to have, you know, because, you know, in every novel, you want to have not just your plot line, your mystery plot, but you want to have your character arc. You want to have them have some, you know, story that they've got going in their head that they need to tweak or disprove in order to be able to solve that mystery. And for example, in Down a Duck River, without wanting to give too many spoilers, you know, he grew up very sort of, you know, bare knuckles and tough. And, you know, at one point, Belinda, his love interest, says to him, you know, you love to be the rescuer, which is great. That stands you in good stead as a policeman. But I think part of the reason you do it is so you never have to admit your own vulnerabilities.
Ooh.
And Corvin poo-poos it and says, no, that's not, and has to kind of eventually come around and understand that his vulnerability will help him be a better policeman. And, you know, so that's, you know, so that's kind of one of these arcs that I want to trace. So, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, you know, his love interest is the one that points out to him, you need to be in touch with your inner vulnerabilities, because my next question for you is about writing from the point of view of a male protagonist. I've not pulled that off. I've tried. I've failed. That's okay. But were there challenges for you in because you've written, you know, female protagonists as well, of course, but were there some challenges for you, or did you find that came fairly easily?
No, it didn't come easily.
Okay.
But what I did was I found a bunch of books with male protagonists in them that felt right to me, that felt kind of they had that voice that felt masculine. And I read them out loud. A chapter here, a chapter there. One of the books I used was Tana French's Faithful Place. She has Frank Mackey, and he's got a really compelling voice, and it is very, very masculine. And so I would read it out loud. Another one is there's a, you know, I would just kind of like pull down books by Whoops, did I just lose you?
No.
No. So I would pull down books by male authors and just read out loud. Robert Ludlum. I mean, I was, I was raised on that. Like I read that as a teenager. I think Hunt for Red October was another one that I read out loud to myself just to kind of get, a certain cadence in my head before I started writing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because I think your ear is a better guide than your eye when it comes to.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I like that. That's very clever. And I can see where a writer could apply that to, if you're trying a new genre, if you're trying a new style, if you've always written kind of more somber, but you want to try your hand at something funny. That's a great piece of advice. I love that.
Yeah.
So I'm always curious, and I get this question too all the time, but I'm always curious with other writers who work in a historical setting, how do you juggle the research versus the creative writing? Is it like all one and then all the other, or all the balls are in the air and you're hoping they don't fall? Or
yes, that balls in the air thing. Yeah, that's me. Honestly, I think one of my biggest challenges these days has been to manage not so much the research and the writing. Those two things feel kind of fluid. The marketing, the other stuff that we do as writers, and they're all a pleasure. Author talks, book clubs. Right now, I'm working on an essay for Crime Reads on the rise of the London police, which was a completely haphazard business back in the early 1800s. It's all a pleasure to do that, but it does take a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And so that's a piece that, until you're kind of like rolling and you have a book out and that kind of thing, isn't really part of the puzzle yet. So my difficult thing has been, trying to, I think, balance that. But when it comes to like the research and the writing, they definitely go hand in hand. I usually begin with a story, and I can get about maybe 2 to 3 chapters in, just kind of with that initial impulse, and then I start researching, and pieces, like really interesting factoids and pieces drop in. Like at the end of A Trace of Deceit, I was trying to figure out, okay, how is this painting going to be potentially sold secretly but legally? And I started reading around. I couldn't figure this out. And then it's kind of like the universe drops it in your lap. I was reading a New Yorker article in which they talked about the open market. And this is this weird law that was still on the books until like the 1990s. And it basically said that if you sell, like, for example, let's say you have a cow, okay? I steal your cow. I decide I want to sell the cow to my friend Marge, okay? As long as I sell that cow in the open market between sunrise and sunset, I get the money for the cow. She gets the cow. You get nothing.
Wait a minute. And that's my cow.
This isn't fair, does it? But the was that in the 17th century, you have a village, and if you're not smart enough to know that your cow is missing and to go look for it in the market, then you're out of luck. You've lost your cow. So this holds true for artwork, and so as long as my villain sells the painting in this open market, in this designated open market in London, it's a legitimate sale.
Wow.
Even though it's stolen. And this was on the books until the 1990s. And you know what finally took it off was that some thieves went into one of the temples, one of the London, where the London lawyers gather, and they stole 2, I think it was John Singer Sargent paintings. And the lawyers were like, wait a minute, because they were taken and then they were sold in one of these open markets. And so it was legit. And the lawyers were like, okay, we got to get this off the books. This doesn't work anymore.
We have to change this law. We don't like this law anymore.
Now, Jess, your cow is safe. So
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I was about to run out of here and go look in the backyard to
Look
make
for
sure
your
my
cow,
cow is still there, or at least my cat, in the
right? Or
sun.
your cat or your cow. But but that was something that came late in the process. I didn't know that was coming, and I just happened to I came across it in this article. I thought, oh, there it is. That's what I need. So
Wow.
yeah.
So I like your tip of reading out loud to learn cadence. I'm just curious, do you think listening to audiobooks counts, or must we read out loud?
Oh.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm thinking we need to read out loud to kind of internalize it.
yeah, like it's almost like your mouth needs to be making the words, making the sounds. I,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I imagine that if you listen to, I mean, and I don't listen to audiobooks very often. In fact, when we were choosing a voice for Down a Dark River, a narrator, they sent me three, and I played them for friends of mine who do audiobooks because I thought they all
Oh,
sound nice to me, and my friends had very definite opinions about what they liked and what they. Fortunately, most of them seemed to agree on one. So I don't really do audiobooks very often, but I imagine that if you were to listen to um, a male narrator reading, a male first person, that would probably be, a good way to tune in to that.
a similar.
Yeah.
Interesting. Or read out loud and drink lots of tea. um, any other final thoughts about your work or tips you'd like to share with writers? Just anything else before we wrap up that you'd like to share? Of course, everybody should go get your book, Down a Dark River. But in
Yes, I hope
addition to
people
that,
do. I hope people do. Um, I was thinking recently about mysteries, and I'd love actually to know your take on this. So someone asked me recently, I mean, like someone basically, she said, you seem like a really nice person. Why do you do all this stuff with murder and death? And I said, I'm, I think that part of the reason that I write mysteries and part of the reason that I read mysteries is that when I was a child, and I don't think that this is particular, I don't think I'm special in any way. There were things that were very, very confusing, things
mm-hmm,
that I didn't understand at all, that were happening in my house, outside my house. And I think that what a mystery is you begin with chaos and confusion and a kind of disconcerting, uneasy sense of, well, like, why is the dead body here? Or, whatever it is that we're beginning with. And there's an arc from confusion to clarity.
mm-hmm.
And I don't think we ever tire of that arc.
Yeah.
I think that arc is a very satisfying one for most of us. And so I just kind of wonder, I mean, do you feel like that's part of why people are drawn to the mystery genre?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I think there's this, you get a sense of order is finally reset in this upset world. This sense of control, this sense of, yeah, things can get really terrifying and, scary, but it's going to be okay. And that applies to, the horror genre as well. But I think in mysteries, there's also this puzzle to be solved. Like if you don't know, you will eventually, and it'll be okay. So yeah, I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of catharsis in that.
Yeah.
I know that's why I like to read mysteries and um, write them, is that sense of not control like a control freak, but a sense of there's if there isn't right now, there's going to be order in the world fairly quickly
Mhm. Mhm.
within 300 pages.
Yes. Yep.
And that's lovely to escape to. And you know,
Mhm. Yeah, because our real world isn't like that.
no,
Not
no,
always.
it's one rambling narrative with lots of loose ends.
Mhm.
And and we hopefully don't have too many loose ends and mysteries. And that there's a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah.
So well, thank you very much for joining me,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Again, look up Karen's new book and read it. Down a Dark River, just out. Look up all of her other books. Her website is karenodden.com. just like her name. So thank you again very much. And thank you for joining me on Tea with Jess. So everyone, until our next tea break, take care of yourselves and your loved ones.
Thank you.